All right, we are live on Facebook. So Chase, as soon as anyone comes into the waiting room, I can admit them here, but we'll go ahead and get started because I know you said 6 and it is 6. So
okay.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our Psychology Social Hour. Today we have Dr. Chase Ogwin from Northwest Missouri State University. He is a theoretical psychologist and assistant professor at Northwest, where he teaches the history and theories of psychology classes, as well as being the coordinator of the general psychology program. He received his bachelor's in clinical psychology from Brigham Young University.
University.
Thank you. I'm trying to read it, and I said Birmingham. It is Brigham. Thank you. Yeah. His master's in humanistic psychology and PhD in consciousness and society from the University of West Georgia. Dr. Ogwin's research interests are threefold. His published work on the nature of weird fiction and the ineffable. He's been studying the psychology of horror for the last 10 years, writing his master's thesis on that relationship between personality variables and horror genre engagement. He's been featured in Bustle magazine, who's a dozen national and international psychology conferences, and is currently co-authoring a book on the role of race in horror. He's also published works in parapsychology, exploring apparition experiences created in a laboratory. Recently co-authored a book with Routledge exploring the recent social justice movements and their implications for subjectivity as viewed from the lens of theoretical and philosophical psychology. Thank you, Dr. Chase, for joining us today. And I will go ahead and hand over the presentation to you. After the presentation, we will have a short time at the end for questions. So feel free, if you're joining us from Zoom, to unmute yourself at that point, or if you're joining us on Facebook Live, feel free to write those in the comments, and we'll get those answered at the end of the talk.
Perfect. Okay, let me get the screen share going here. Nope, wrong screen. Okay, 1 second. Sorry, fighting with PowerPoint here. Okay, there we go. Sorry, I don't actually like PowerPoint very much. I refuse to use it in class because it turns my students into little stenographers. So, but we're going to use that here because it works for this medium better. So, as Sarah was saying, I'm talking about the history of madness today. We'll talk about its transition into the word mental illness, because that's actually a portion of the history that goes on. So in psychology, we have this notion of what we call the limen. Now, limens are typically something we talk about in sensation and perception psychology, about the kinds of stimulus in the environment that we can see, what we sense and perceive. So it works something like this. If you have a stimulus that crosses this certain threshold within our minds, then we become consciously aware of the existence of that stimulus. And if you get something that doesn't quite make it, then that's said to be subliminal. But in the history of mental illness, we also concern ourselves with this notion of limens, particularly when we talk about the notions of taboo and prohibitions. As civilizations have evolved, what is considered liminal, the things that are in between, have changed. So we start way back. We have to roll back the curtain all the way back to the ancient Greeks if we want to look at where we start really thinking about humanity in recorded history, talking about madness. So I've got books in here. They're bolded whenever I've used something specifically where I'm getting my information, in case you want to look at those yourself. So we have the book from a great history psychologist, Daniel N. Robinson. This book is not necessarily for the faint of heart. It's a little discipline specific, called Wild Beasts and Idle Humors. And he helps us understand that the ancient Greeks and the Romans had a notion of madness that was different than what we would think of as physical illness. We know this because they codified it in their laws. They were some of the earliest examples of what we think of as the insanity plea or the insanity defense. The Greeks recognized madness as separate from illness. And by the time we get to the Romans, we actually had some loose categories of what we might call madness for legal reasons. I've got a few of them listed here that Dr. Robinson goes over. We have non compos mentis, which was to be one out of one's mind. This would be a madness that they considered something that set in after you were born. Being a alcoholic, for example, might be considered, being a drunken alcoholic all the time would be considered a version of madness. So if you did something while you were drunk or while you were drugged, and the Romans were great experimenters with early hallucinogens and other kinds of drugs, and you did something, you could claim non compos mentis, that you were out of your mind. You weren't responsible for what you were doing. Then they have fanaticus. This was what they considered holy madness or religious madness. We see a lot of this as someone who becomes possessed by the gods or by muses. We see a lot of this in early Roman ideas of the bacchanal, right? Kind of wild orgiastic parties that would involve hallucinogenics and all sorts of other things. And sometimes people went crazy and did all sorts of very strange things, sometimes violent things. And so this was considered a separate version of what we would think of as madness. Idiotis was a version of madness. This is what we might think of as someone with a mental deficiency that they're born with, something like Down syndrome or autism. Sometimes they're referred to what we in the Middle Ages will call them fools. Would be this idea that you were born incapable of caring for oneself. So you were kind of a child and a human being at the same time. And we're going to get back to this notion of the limen, because we again see in our last example, the rampage, what we would today call psychosis. Now, let's roll back to this idea of the limen, because even in these ancient Roman examples, we see where people start to sit in between different states that aren't quite right. We might think of as the state between beast and man, in the case of a fury, right? Or the case of madness or a psychotic. But a lot of our understanding of limens today, we owe a great deal to a woman anthropologist named Mary Douglas. And she wrote this great book called Purity and Danger, an analysis of concepts of pollution and taboo. And Mary goes back and looks through all of the ancient cultures and ancient religions and history and tries to figure out what it is that defines something as impure, something that is undesirable. So what she found is that human beings have always had trouble with the notion of things that are just on the border, just on our understanding. And she calls this concept, things that exist in there, this notion of interstitialness. She uses a great example from example like Jewish kosher law. And I've got this picture of a lobster here in the bottom corner. She found that in most cultures, things that were considered impure and therefore dangerous and taboo were to consume or to interact with or to do things with, found themselves in between categories. So, for example, you have something like a lobster or any shellfish that on one hand behaves a lot like a fish. It breathes underwater, it swims around. But on the other hand, it looks like a bug. Now, fish were considered kosher for eating, and bugs, believe it or not, were considered kosher for eating. But shellfish were not. They were something in between, something interstitial. And we still have ideas and problematics. We use interstitialness to convey monstrosity and horror today. I have a picture over here in the bottom corner of Clive Barker's Cenobites from his book, The Hellbound Hearts, or the movie Hellraiser, where we see beings who are androgynous in appearance, somewhere between living and dead, somewhere between pleasure and pain. They exist in a kind of in-between space, and madness has always lived in this place for us. So when something becomes too violent, too horrifying to confront, then we place it in this kind of category. Now, this will come into play in our role of diagnostics of madness. when people start engaging in activities that are taboo or prohibited by the social norms. Now, we have to consider the ideas of prohibition and taboos too. So if we look at the history of society and then we look at things that were considered to be taboo, we start to see some interesting classifications of mental illness. So, for example, society throughout the course of humanity has dictated various positions that women should act or think in. And when they start to diverge from that, if they start to become too masculine, then in certain times, this is being considered something wrong. Something is not behaving as it should. We can look to the examples of something like the lobotomy. We're going to talk about a little bit later down the road here. But often could be given to or early feminist women could find themselves lobotomized by their husband for acting uppity, for acting too masculine. So this limit of the interstitial is going to play a clear role. I'm going to trace it a little further here. So the Greeks had this idea that madness was something that was happening in the brain. Both Plato and Aristotle felt, and Hippocrates as well, early medicine, felt that madness existed in the brain. When we lose the Roman Empire and Western Europe takes a big slide in its approach to sciences, we enter what we quote unquote call the Dark Ages. No one ever actually called it that, and it was only dark in very particular parts of Europe. But madness, again, takes a new definition. It takes on a new thing. And again, we see the notion of people who are behaving on the fringes of society, on the edges. So most Psych 101 students will tell you, if you talk about what did the ancient people think of madness, they won't go so far back as the Greeks. Most people go so far back as the Middle Ages, and they start looking at like, oh, well, most versions of mental illness were thought to be the result of possession or witchcraft or fairies. And we do see this, some very strange things to help us understand. And we see human beings trying to grasp these people who are living in a fringe state. A great example, I've got here on the left, a picture of the changeling. A changeling is a very interesting example of madness in the Middle Ages, particularly up in what areas that now occupy the United Kingdom. Most changelings today were thought to be, well, the concept of the changeling was this, is that you had a person who either as a baby, but this could also happen to adults, who would suddenly start behaving differently than they used to. So think about if we look at autism, for example, autism has an onset that happens around the time you hit toddlerdom. Now, most modern psychologists, we can diagnose autism even in their first year of life, but think about a time where your child seems to be behaving normally, and then you wake up one day and they're not. They may have something called regressive autism. This child stops speaking. They have the inability to speak. They start acting erratically. How do you explain this? Right? Well, these people turned to the mythologies and the folklore of their time and said, well, clearly this isn't my child anymore. Something has happened. They have been switched. And the process of trying to cure people from changelings were terrible. You know, the idea that fairies didn't like fire. And so you would put these people closer and closer until you maybe even putting them inside of a fireplace and burning them alive. Both children and adults would experience this. In adults, we would see this happen in people we would now consider bipolar, where someone goes out and comes back in a frenetic, frantic state that we would think of as a manic state today. In those days and eras where thoughts like this, clearly this person went wandering out in the woods one day and suddenly comes back. They must have been kidnapped by fairies and replaced by this shape-shifting monster, right? Something that clearly this couldn't have been us. And again, same kind of exposure, what we would think of as waterboarding or drowning, fire, branding, all sorts of essential torture to try to get these people to behave normally again, to drive out the fairy, to force them to bring it back, which of course never happened and never worked. But that was what they were thinking. Possession takes another interesting place. I've got a picture of a possession here. Again, things that we might think of today as psychoticisms, schizophrenia, delusions, might be chalked up to possession. Someone acts normally into their 20s, and suddenly one day wakes up raving and screaming about things they can see that nobody else can, talking in voices that nobody, that doesn't make any sense. They might be engaging in something called echolalia, which is something, a positive symptom of schizophrenia that makes people think, or it doesn't sound normal. They repeat words, or they repeat parts of words, or they might have had something like a stroke, engage and get something called what we call aphasia, vocal aphasia, where the language becomes a kind of word salad and doesn't make any sense, or even phonemes, the word, they don't even sound like words but might sound like another language. Being xenoglossy being a classic symptom of exorcisms, or possession in need of an exorcism. So this possession and witchcraft stuff comes along, and it plays an interesting part in Europe. But we start to leave this and we enter the Middle Ages. With the birth of the Renaissance, we see a kind of return to science, this age of reason. But we still need to keep in mind this notion of the limen. So for this next section, there's a debt of gratitude to the work of Michel Foucault, who was a French post-structuralist intellectual in the 1960s. But before he moved into his more political stuff, he invented a process that he called historical archaeology, where he would trace an idea backwards and find all these kind of weird bits and bobs that at first don't seem interrelated, but lead us into seeing how something developed, like mental illness. And he has a great book called Madness and Civilization, A History of Insanity in the Age of Reason. And he picks up this idea of, well, how did we get to the modern psychiatric hospital, the modern treatment of human beings, the way we think of it, from the Dark Ages? And Foucault traces madness and the need for what we think of today as mental illness back to the age of leprosy. Now, something interesting about leprosy is that for thousands of years, leprosy has been a bane of human existence. I mean, you find leprosy in the Bible, it's in the Quran, it's in the Torah, right? There are certain rituals for leprosy, how you deal with the leper. And then suddenly we wake up one day as the human race and leprosy seems to disappear. I've asked doctors about this before, medical doctors, and there's like, it seems to be that basically everybody was going to get it. Now you can still get leprosy today, but for the most part, everybody who seemed to was going to get it, got it, and either got better or died. But the leper seems to disappear. Now, the leper, for Foucault says, occupies a certain liminal space for humanity. But when the leper disappears, something needs to fill that space. Foucault makes this argument that power needs places to enact itself upon. It doesn't like vacuum, so it will quickly find other places. And at first we see this turn to the fool, right? Those persons that the ancient Romans would have labeled as the idiotus, right? The idiot. Now, the fool, for a long time, what we would do with people who were born this way is that if the town would support them for a time, and then if they got rambunctious or they got uncontrollable or unsustainable or they got too many, they would simply just kick them out or put them at the doorstep of another city and make them deal with them for a while. And there's even stories about the ship of fools, right? Where we would put a whole bunch of these people onto a boat and then send them down the Rhine River to be somebody else's problem wherever they might land. And that worked for a time, but things were also changing socially, economically, and politically in new kinds of ways. New forms of government were emerging, new forms of economy were emerging. This is where we start to see the birth of the city-state, the birth of capitalism, the birth of the church is going to reestablish itself in a new kind of way, right? Because of the Renaissance, the church has to have its hand in government more often to keep science at bay. So we see these new edges showing up, these new limens. And we get, again, this notion of, well, who are the mad? Who are the people that need to occupy this place? And interestingly enough, the government and the church would get together and they would form these hospitals that they would to take care of the mentally infirm, the fools, essentially. But they would also take up anybody who seemed to show a lack of reason. Now, what was this reason? This was a sticky question. And what Foucault kind of traces out is it kind of shifts over time, but it also opens up these categories for people to be considered mad. Now, why would they want to do this? Well, what becomes interesting is these hospitals, in order to maintain themselves, they could either get donations from these large wealthy families, or they could turn themselves into little industrial factories. And this is exactly what happened. But you need people to work these factories. So towns would go through, they would have the guard that were of these little hospitals, right? These institutions set up by the state and by the church, but were beholden to neither. They had their own kind of self-government, and they would say, round everybody up. And anybody who, they would round up the, what we traditionally think of the mentally ill, they would round up the infirm, and they would round up the poor. The reason being is that reason had been determined that nobody wants to be poor. So if these people who have been shunted by this new capital system, who can't find work or have found themselves out of place because they used to have these substance farmings and now everything's moving to the cities and now we've got all these things, people don't know what to do with themselves or how to keep themselves. They must be poor, they're begging, then they must be insane, because only an insane person wouldn't want to work. Only an insane person would want to stay poor. So they would round up the poor and put them to work inside of these factories. And how would they be determined if they were insane or not? Well, you would be captured by these soldiers sent from these institutions, brought before a judge who would then say, I think you're insane. And there was no appeal, no other external other than this person who was judge and executioner of your fate, so to speak. And you would be made to work in these places. But you would also be, these people would be put side by side with the mentally infirm, the psychotic, the deranged, I'm using terms that would have been very common in this time, and made to work, and they would be given different kinds of jobs. These were not great places. Dickens, of course, is famous for making us understand the workhouse, right? Because these would start in the 1600s and continue on into the 19th century. So at this time, we also get appearance of a new limen, the limen between, again, back to with using the Romans idea, as Roman culture is coming back, as the notion of Hippocrates and these other things are coming out in the birth of the Renaissance, the rediscovery of Greek and Roman culture, right? The idea that the mad were somewhere between the rational man and the animal. And the loss of reason and the return to the beast was this notion of insanity, that people were essentially falling out of reason back into an animal-like nature. So this would do some interesting things, because at the same time, we're also starting to see the birth of what we will eventually become the modern university and modern science. So we want to classify things. Carl Linnaeus is already doing his work in classifying the natural world. And so madness becomes this notion that we want to look at as we classify the world in this way too. So we have this mixture of the church and the state. But then we see some shifts, some interesting things start happening as we get out of the 17th century and into the 17th and 18th century, and we get into the 19th century. The 19th century, of course, sees a huge explosion in advances in anatomy and biology and medicine. And this changes the way we start to understand things. So some of the first things we come to understand, so right at the end of the 18th century, we see advances in understanding of neurology and the muscular systems. This is the time where Mary Shelley is going to see a demonstration of galvanism, where we hook up cut off monkey fists and we hook them up to electrodes and watch the hand move, which of course will go on to inspire her to write the book Frankenstein. But this isn't the only advances that we're seeing in medicine. We get Francis Gall, who is known as the father of phrenology, which we're going to talk about in a minute, but he would also go on to advance our notions of understanding of the brain. We understand that it comes in pieces. So we see this kind of separation away from the church's explanation of madness as this notion of the loss of reason, the loss of the soul, to back to maybe these are physical things. Of course, we can't talk about the rise of the medical model leaving the 18th century into the 19th century without talking about Philippe Pinel. Pinel, of course, is famous for freeing the mad. He would enter these hospitals and these workhouses and realize that the most violent of these people, or what was quote unquote deemed violent, people who were uncontrollable, were chained up and locked in dungeons. And Pinel, of course, would famously go in and release the mad, right? Freeing them from the insane asylum, saying, if we treat them like humans, they actually get a little bit better. They stop raving and they stop acting so insensibly when we start treating them well. And Pinel is going to go on to explore all sorts of mental illnesses for the first time and really start looking at them. Now, Pinel is going to, as we're going to see in a word here, use the notion of moral illness. And by moral, he doesn't mean the ethical sense. He's meaning emotional illnesses, that emotions might be something going on. What Pinel gets wrong, and it reflects in the way that it's going to, but unfortunately it's going to influence nearly the next century of study in mental illness, is that he feels that it's not the brain, but the peripheral nervous system and the digestive system are what are in control or what are causing mental illnesses. So emotions get in the way, but the reason you're experiencing these emotions wrong is because you're seeing the world wrong or hearing the world wrong or feeling the world wrong. It's the senses are being tricked or deceived. But this moves madness away from a problem of the spirit, away from the witchcraft and the possession and the other things that are being deemed as being causes of madness. It's no longer demons and witches and fairies, but back to the body. We're seeing the birth of what we will call the medical model of mental illness. Now, what was interesting about this medical model, though, was that along with Pinel, and we'll see some others, is that they felt that madness was something that you could contract, something that you could catch, and not from a germ, not from disease in the typical way we think about it, but rather you would contract it from, or would have a mental illness exacerbated by environmental factors. Again, back to these emotions. If you were in a place where you were always, where there are too many high emotions, if you were working yourself up because your environment was overly stressful or overly exciting, then you might give yourself a problem and you might change the way your body responds. And so the environment could cause, and what you took in, what kind of culture you were experiencing, so things you were reading, could cause some problems. So we see some improvement, particularly with Pinel no longer chaining these people, no longer dungeoning these people or imprisoning these people, but to say, like, maybe we can treat them by being nice to them, by caring for them, they might get better. We still see some problems. And the 19th century opens up this fascinating era in conjunction with this new notion of madness. We see the birth of something we call sensationalist literature. Made famous, of course, by people like Wilkie Collins and Charles Dickens, and on the state side, people like Edgar Allan Poe. And I highlight sensationalist literature as a notion of this history of madness because it gives us this great window for what the Victorian era of Europe was thinking about and what madness was and how people contracted it. Now, our sensationalist authors would exaggerate, but they weren't making new things up. They were simply showing it in a slightly exaggerated form, right? So Poe is a great example of this notion of contagious madness, right? I've got here a picture down here in the bottom left, that the Fall of the House of Usher, right? That madness might be something that it passes along in families and you might catch. So if your father was mad, then you might go mad, then your sister might go mad, and madness might be everywhere, and it might leave itself in a place. And if other people went to that place, they too could catch madness. We see let me highlight this central one. This one's an interesting one. Charlotte Perkins Gilman highlights an interesting problem at this time with this approach to madness, this new medical model, and this idea that it's an emotional excitement. Charlotte Perkins Gilman writes a book called The Yellow Wallpaper, and it's actually semi-autobiographical. It's a piece of weird fiction. Talking about a woman who slowly loses her mind as she is locked in the bedroom of this country house with this horrendous yellow wallpaper. And it's the only thing she sees. Because what this woman has been exposed to in the story, and something that Charlotte Perkins Gilman herself would go through, was something that physicians would prescribe for certain kinds of madness, in particular postpartum depression, called the rest cure. And the rest cure I highlight because it's this fascinating bit. Physicians would say, the problem that a woman is experiencing is that she's been too excited. There's been too much excitement for the poor female brain to cope with, right? And there's a lot of sexism in these early days of mental illness, that women were far more likely to be susceptible to these things. And so because their minds were just weaker. And so what you would do is you would lock these women in a room by themselves with literally nothing to do. They're not allowed to engage in any kind of mental activity. They are simply supposed to rest. This is equivalent to, say, like putting someone in solitary confinement, and they would be there for weeks, sometimes months at a time. And in the case if it didn't work, then they would institutionalize these women and put them in essentially in an insane asylum, doing the exact same thing for years. And of course, this often exacerbated the underlying mental illness. It didn't ever fix it. And the case of the yellow wallpaper shows this exact story, right? A woman's descent into madness because of this rest cure. Charlotte Perkins Gilman would go on to be an advocate for women's health rights and against practices like this, because of her own subjection to it. And the yellow wallpaper was an example of it. Wilkie Collins, I saved this one over here. Wilkie Collins is a great example of both the showing us what these mental issues would look like and thought to exist in his time, but also because he was a target often by local preachers and local government officials, saying that reading his books would cause the very illnesses that were so sensational, they'd get you so revved up emotionally that then your nerves, your physical nerves, your body would be overexcited that you would actually go mad from reading these kinds of works. Dickens would catch flack with this too. So this notion it continues on. Now, let me highlight some Victorian era mental illnesses because they had some interesting categories for these kinds of approaches that they took. So one of the things you could be diagnosed with by a psychiatrist. Now, psychiatry sees its birth in Pinel. Pinel is considered the father of modern psychiatry, that the body is doing something to exacerbate a mental problem. But again, it's a problem of the body. So one of these psychiatrists, you might be diagnosed with mania. Now, today, mania is a very specific set of symptoms that evolves around bipolar disorder involving a high excitement of energy. But in the 19th century, in the Victorian era, right, mania is a raving madness. So the bedlam, right? The typical association with people who are just shrieking and shouting, "I'm Napoleon," right? Like that kind of delusional shrieking, shouting, what we consider like when you think of a haunted insane asylum, right? Or, before it becomes haunted and all the crazy patients are in it. That would be what they would have considered mania. Typically, these are things we would associate now with schizophrenia. Which is interesting because schizophrenia takes on the next one, what we call dementia, a breakdown of any connection between ideas. This would pick up a lot of different things, a big umbrella term here. So dementia praecoxia, which is the original diagnosis we did for what we now call schizophrenia, was this idea was any time where the words didn't connect or ideas didn't connect. So mental retardation, which we now call intellectual deficit disorder, would be considered a version of dementia. What we think of as dementia in the elderly, obviously, still actually holds this idea. It's one of the places where we actually still see a kind of the old traces of Victorian era ideas tracing through, right? Where as a person ages, their ability to hold the ideas together. We see this in Alzheimer's in particular. The ideas aren't holding together. Of course, the psychotic that we think of as the schizophrenic would also be picked up in this. Melancholia is an interesting one. It is a quick way you might think of it as is what we might think of as clinical depression today. but that doesn't quite catch it. It catches quite a few different things. So they defined it as the decreased motility and morosity. These definitions, by the way, come out of one of the early manuals that was given in psychiatry for these kinds of illnesses. Decrease in motility and morosity. So they move less and they sit around more. But a lot of things could be diagnosed as melancholia. Low energy levels, which could be caused by vitamin deficiencies. The person might said to be melancholic. Even this word gets its roots. If we go back to the ancient Greeks and Romans again, melancholia is notion of the humor being out of balance, right? Colicky, that an idea of a lot of black bile is where we get this idea of melancholia, that you're morose, you're sad, you're blue. But you could also, grief might be left under this melancholy. So long lasting grief. So if you have a widow who is grieving for extended period of time, would be considered melancholic. Our classical depressives would be considered melancholic. So this would be all sorts of places for this. The one I was kind of mentioning and want to talk a little more about is what would be umbrella term would be called moral insanity. Now, moral insanity picked up a lot of different things. And some of this, the stuff I was mentioning about Wilkie Collins, Charlotte Perkins Gilman's, and Edgar Allan Poe, this was considered a madness consisting in a morbid perversion of the natural feelings, affections, inclinations, temper, habits, moral dispositions, and natural impulses without any remarkable disorder or defect of the interest or knowing and reasoning faculties, and particularly without any insane illusion or hallucination. So what this means is you've got a person who has one thing that's off. They seem to be able to talk and reason. They're clearly not insane in the normal way that we think of insanity, especially back then, the kind of bedlam, raving mad, demented, or schizophrenic kind of thing. There was something off about them. Now, what this could be took on a variety of different forms. And for these things, you could be institutionalized, you could be subjected to medical examinations, all sorts of interesting and ineffective medical cures, things like ice baths and overheating and all sorts of interesting things to try to cure you of this. But things that could fall under this, homosexuality would definitely fall under this at this time, right? The natural dispositions or natural feelings. So the idea of a woman or a man being attracted to another woman or man. Again, think about this notion of the limens, right? You have these people who categorically look like a man or a woman, but are attracted to the same gender, which should not happen, because by the cultural understanding of that, those two categories, they should be attracted to the opposite. So these people are living in a limen. A great example I have on here, one that Wilkie Collins made famous, and then we later see in Poe, or we see also in Poe, and then later see in later Dickens, such as The Bleak House. We get this idea or ideation that we call monomania. Now this doesn't exist anymore. And this is interesting. Why? So monomania was considered a person who has a false belief in one thing, but in all other aspects is being sound. Now, this false belief would be that they held something important above all else. Great example of this in the time would be Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, right? The creation of Robert Louis Stevenson. So Dr. Jekyll is obsessed with pure goodness and finding a way to excise his evil side or revel in his evil side, but keeping his pure side totally pure. Right now, if you've read the novel, you understand how hypocritical that Jekyll really is. But this idea that he's obsessed, this one obsession, right? I'm going to find the cure to villainy. I'm going to find the cure to badness. I'm going to separate myself in such a way that eventually I won't ever have to be bad again, or engage in taboo practices. And we know from the story that Jekyll is engaged in some kind of lascivious libertine vices, right? The speculation of whether that was because he's a closeted homosexual or not, right? All sorts of things are speculated, but basically he wants to save face, but he's obsessed with it. Wilkie Collins in The Woman in White gives great examples of monomania. Obsession with one particular person or finding the truth of the mystery. Sherlock Holmes would be considered a monomaniac, kind of eccentric, like you're always after finding the truth. Now, what's interesting is that monomania doesn't exist anymore today. Why? Has it changed? Do we no longer have monomaniacs? No, we do. But we stopped considering that a culturally inappropriate thing. Let me give you two examples of modern, what in Victorian times would have been considered monomaniacs. You got Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, right? These two men would be considered monomaniacs. A monomaniac was anybody who would would pursue one thing above all else and leave the other pursuits, what we would think of as hobbies or other curiosities, to the side. Today, we don't do that anymore. As a matter of fact, we encourage monomania. In our current culture, in our current political and economic climates, monomania is thought to be, we use different words. We say driven. We say type A personalities. We call them go-getters, right? And we even try to encourage it in ourselves. We pursue the dollar, the economic freedoms. We pursue all one thing, or the career, right? Above all else. We even try to make our hobbies, which were once considered, say, in Victorian times, as something healthy, as a kind of other outlet to have multiple interests, whereas what was the ideal Victorian mental state, right? To be a kind of Renaissance man approach, right? I know a little bit of philosophy and a little bit of biology and a little bit of mathematics and a little bit of economy, right? But now we hyper focus ourselves, and even our hobbies must be monetized. What's the angle that I can make even the thing I'm doing for fun work for me? That would be monomania in Victorian times. So we get to this 19th century, right? So the 1800s, where is psychology in all of this, right? Psychiatry is a medical field, a biological field, and this is all happening in the body. Where is psychology in all of this? This is a big question. So it starts out to understand is that psychology didn't exist as a formal academic discipline until 1879, when Wilhelm Wundt would establish the very first psychological laboratory in Leipzig, Germany. And largely, the interest that he had was physiological. Again, the medicine was ruling everything. Anatomy and physiology were the sciences of the day, along with chemistry. And we wanted to know how the mind could be understood in this way. And so Wundt would establish the first laboratory, and it was studying sensation perception. How do we understand the world as we get it? These notions of the limens, right? Where actually this is when they would be discovered. Is just prior to this, we had the psychophysiologists understanding that certain things had certain thresholds. And Wundt would train almost all of the early psychologists, particularly the American psychologists, and those who would go on to establish the American laboratories would be trained under Wundt. And Wundt himself didn't have any psychological interest in what we would think of as mental illness, because it was thought that these people's bodies are not functional, so they can't tell us anything useful because they're broken. It would be like trying to learn to be a clockmaker in a broken or shattered clock. So Wundt in Germany is not going to pursue mental illness with any real vigor. He does so a little bit on the side in something he calls Völker psychology, or what we think of as the social psych. And while that would be the majority of what he would spend his life writing, it would not be what he would become famous for. He didn't do a lot of promotion of that end so much as he did for his laboratory. On the United States, we would our first laboratory over here, we would get a guy named Titchener. And Titchener, again, was interested in the study of consciousness as consciousness' sake. And again, it's sensation perception. How do we perceive the things we put in our mouths or the feelings that we get? And what's the mental activity going on? Titchener was literally trying to look for a periodic table of the brain. He felt that each sensation, there were elements for each sensation in the brain, and they literally kind of came together like Lego bricks inside our head. And he was looking for what were the smallest bits and pieces of sensation to find that out. And he had no interest in the mentally ill. He specifically avoided them because he felt that they are clearly broken. Their brains aren't working the way it's supposed to. So there's nothing to be gained from that. And so what we see in the United States is something very similar to going on. We see largely the notion of the medical model. This is going to change right at the tail end of the 19th century. And it's going to change with first of all, when we get William James, who actually is a contemporary of Titchener and had his own psychological laboratory even before Wundt's. But because his was a demonstrative laboratory and not a psychological or not a formal experimental laboratory, it's not credited as such. But James is going to influence another school of psychology that's going to come on the curtails of Titchener, and with the advent of Darwin, called functionalism. And this was saying, well, the mind's doing something, functionalists would say, for a reason. That it's evolved pieces and it behaves in ways because it's adapting. Again, borrowing heavily from these new notions that Darwin has made popular. And James is going to also say, we need to understand how are the mentally ill viewing the world? What are they looking at? How are we seeing it? But neither of these is coming out of a vacuum, because along with Darwin, as I mentioned before, which is giving us this perspective of evolution, giving us this perspective of that the brain is functioning in these ways, so the mentally ill might tell us how something is not adapting and would be useful to know, and then maybe we could offer treatment, although the functionalists would never have one. If we want to talk about how we talk about mental illness today, the birth of it, we see heavy influences both in functionalism and William James with Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud is going to be a therapeutic first. Freud is going to be the first who is going to approach mental illness as saying it's not in the body, it's body problems. Freud, of course, becomes famous at first because he, with a colleague of his, whom he acts as a consulting colleague and not actually the primary physician, on a large number of cases of a mental illness that was going rampant at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, called hysteria. Again, we don't call it hysteria anymore. We now call it a conversion disorder. It's a psychosomatic disorder. But hysteria was this notion largely affected by women, and hence the name. It got this kind of misogynistic name to it because it was a woman's disease. And the name actually comes to us, again, all the way back from the ancient Greeks, who named it. Hysteria literally means the wandering uterus or the lost uterus, and was conceived of as a woman's problem, for if a woman was not pregnant, then the uterus would get upset and it would wander around the woman's body and shift in weird ways, and then release something and fluids into the body that would cause all of these weird maladies. Now, in Freud's time, these maladies took on a whole bunch of forms that became very common, and it was sweeping through Europe across women. Maladies like paralysis, but paralysis in very strange and very specific and technically physiologically impossible ways. So you would experience something like glove anesthesia. Glove anesthesia is when a hand goes numb from the wrist up. So everything from the wrist up would become numb. The problem is that this is physiologically impossible because the nerves that work in this extend from the fingertips all the way down to the bottom of the forearm, or pretty close to it. So if this is numb, then all of this should be numb. But it wouldn't be. You'd have women going blind, women having epileptic seizures, women or having seizures without epilepsy. And all of this led to an interesting idea, and that something else was going on. Step in just before Freud gets started. As a matter of fact, he went and studied with this man, is a French medical doctor named Charcot. And Charcot is going to be doing a new technique called hypnotism. Now, hypnotism has its own interesting and semi-lurid history. Starts out with this invented by a guy named Mesmer, or discovered by a guy named Mesmer, who then uses it to invent mesmerism. That becomes this kind of parlor trick. It gets outlawed in a lot of places because there were some sexual connotations to it. France in particular had outlawed it for a long time. But it's going to be Charcot who's going to turn around and say, you know what, maybe we can retrieve this tool for medicine. And he will hypnotize these hysteric women. And in trance, suddenly all the symptoms are gone. Paralyzed limbs start gaining their movements. Eyes return sight. Fainting spells cease to happen. Seizures stop. Then he does something interesting, Charcot does. He hypnotizes other women who don't have hysteria. And with post-hypnotic suggestion, when they come out of trance, suddenly act as if they have hysteria. And this puts Freud in a new place. It's saying that it's not, the body is responding to something that is not physical. It's not the peripheral nervous system. There's nothing wrong with these women's voices. That would be another common stuttering or muteness around certain words or times or phrases was very common as these notions of hysteria. There's nothing wrong with their bodies. It's not a peripheral nervous system problem, and it's not a physiological brain problem. It's a psychical problem. Freud will go on after his initial, this is by 1901, he's going to write his landmark book, Interpretation of Dreams, which is the birth of psychoanalysis. And the very first time we're going to see treatment and looking at mental illness as kind of what we would think today as mental illness. By the time we get to the 19-teens, of course, World War I is going to break out, and we see an advent of this new symptom, something we'd never seen really in real numbers before until we get to World War I. And that is what they called battle fatigue or shell shock, what we today now refer to as PTSD. But again, this time now we were seeing soldiers, men, having these same problems, soldiers who were having blindness, paralysis, inability to deafness, all sorts of things that not faking. It's not malingering, which is the psychological term for faking, but these real things. And again, this leads Freud into other directions and into further discoveries about the notion of what the mind is doing. Now, Freud is going to separate himself a little bit from the psychiatry of his day. He's going to use 3 categories for mental illness. And the other things, these things that he felt that psychiatry was doing, some of the things we listed previously, are not mental illnesses themselves, but are symptoms of one of 3 kinds. He would call them neurotics, obsessionals, and psychotics. Now, psychotics were what we typically think of as the schizophrenics, those who have a complete detachment for reality. And Freud felt that even with all of his advances in the talking cure, right, psychoanalysis, the therapy he's going to invent, and frankly is still the therapy, even though it gets all sorts of different names, the therapy that is largely the basis of every therapy today, is psychotics were unhelpable because they couldn't engage in language. They couldn't engage in speaking in the same kinds of way. This has been challenged in modern psychoanalytic theory, but in Freud's time, this is where it was. And then you had the neurotics and you have the obsessionals. But these were loose categories and more about like what the mental structure of this person was about and less about the particular problems they were showing, because Freud felt that problems might show similarly for different reasons. The obsessional might have what we would think of as depressive symptoms, melancholic symptoms, for very different psychological reasons than a neurotic might. Now, I don't have time because it's a whole nother kind of lesson or another talk about just distincting between exactly what neurosis and obsessionals were for psychoanalytic theory. But obsessionals, you can think of at the time as like people who are constantly trying to do everything, do it all. A classic example of exceptional today might be like toxic perfectionism. Would be an example of an obsessional. Someone who suffers from debilitating imposter syndrome would be well, that might be a neurotic hysteric too. It's hard to, this is why it's hard, right, is to break it apart. But he felt that most everybody would fall under what he called the neurotic, which is mildly dysfunctional. We get hangups about things, but by and large, it's that. But the symptoms, so like melancholia is a symptom, not a mental illness. Monomania would be a symptom of the obsessional, not a mental illness in and of itself. And he wasn't so much concerned with putting a label on it because he felt it wasn't helpful. Now, this is going to change as we see as Freud's ideas get taken up, not from Freud, but from his followers as they go out into the world post-World War II. So Freud holds a very tight rein on psychoanalysis from the birth of it in the early 1900s until his death in the middle of World War II. And then it will slowly be, he has a lot of fallout with his and that's, he starts to lose the grips of it, particularly as his cancer progresses and he becomes more and more ill and less capable of doing work because the pain is excruciatingly bad for him. But he wins the battle. The cultural battle is won essentially by Freud and his followers. Psychiatry will take up the psychodynamic model. But it's not going to do it in the way Freud would have done it, particularly here in the United States. It gets adapted and it gets changed to fit the more medico terminology that they want to see. And they blend it again back into away from the notion that it's all psychic, right? That it's all mental, that mental illness arrives from problems of thought, problems of words you're not allowed to say, internal prohibitions, right? Internal limits that we're too afraid to cross, but are constantly at war with ourselves to do so. The medical community wants to put the body back in. And so we see a kind of blending occur that like we start using Freudian ideas, but we want to put the brain back into it. And by the time World War II is over and we get into the heyday of what we will call ego psychology in the United States, which is a kind of psychodynamic psychiatry, we are full bore wanting to use Freudian ideas with the medical model. And we kind of get a weird amalgam of that. So 1952 is a landmark year for this idea of the return of the medical model, when a group of psychiatrists who get together and they formally change their name to the APA, not the American Psychological Association, which has existed for almost a century now. They change it to the American Psychiatric Association, and they will develop what is known as the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And it will be developed and published by them. And there, if you look at the DSM, as we come to refer it, the DSM-1, there will be many, many iterations. We are currently on the 5th iteration today. We see in the very first ones, it's an adaptation of saying, okay, there's a little bit of Freud, and a lot of the terminologies they're going to use are Freudian terminologies. They're going to be using words like id and ego and superego. You're going to see obsessionals. You're going to see neurotics. You're going to see hysterics. You're going to see all these words that were common in Freud's parlance and in psychoanalysis. But you're also going to see this introduction of what they called the biopsychosocial model. Now, the biopsychosocial model is great in a lot of ways because it says, hey, there are other factors like environmental factors, like your socioeconomic status, toxins in your environment. And there are also psychological factors, things that Freud would have argued for, right? Things that culture that might be constraining. Women were particularly susceptible to hysteria, not because they were weaker, but because Freud would explain, because there was so much societal pressure on them to be many different things that they couldn't be all of them. And this notion of women's rights is moving through about what women are discovering themselves to be empowered. This is causing them to have these fractures and these fissions. And that's why hysteria is affecting women more than men, not because they're weaker, but because they're under more social pressure, more psychological and social environmental pressure. And the first edition of the DSM is going to look at that, but it's already sneaking in this biology. And it starts to shift. As we move forward, we're going to see a variety of new DSMs come out. Now, the DSM is a controversial, to say the least, topic for most psychologists because every time they revise it, it is done by a board of psychiatrists. Now, psychiatrists, again, are medical doctors who do a specialization in certain kinds of mental illness, usually the heavy hitter things like schizophrenia. And other forms of psychoticism. And when they develop the DSM, sometimes they'll have a psychologist consultant, but they are not allowed to write, nor are they allowed to vote on these things. And this has led the DSM to become progressively more medical and less psychological. And as psychological science has advanced in many ways, largely due to Freud and then Freud's descendants, and then from further ideas in therapeutic circles, it has not had the influence on the DSM. And yet the DSM is how insurance companies classify. If you want to be treated for a mental illness, you have to have a DSM diagnostic. You have to have something from this DSM for the insurance company to accept your treatment, to have it be paid for. Otherwise, it'd be all out of pocket. And as it's gotten progressively more medical, psychologists and their notions of the psychological and sociological explanations and causes and problems that influence mental health are becoming less and less important. And we're seeing even things that seem to be the complete purview of psychology and not psychiatry. So basic emotional problems become suddenly, something like grief becomes suddenly a little more medicalized, uncomfortably so. So let me point out some of the problematics. So the DSM, as it's done this, has, let me give you a cautionary, let me present a cautionary tale for it. Now, this is during the time of the DSM-3, which was from the mid-1970s to the 1980s. There was a joke. It was kind of a sarcastic, tongue-in-cheek joke done by a psychologist called Richard Knoll. And in the 1980s, he was writing a book about psychology in trying to psychology looking at folklore, particularly vampires, werewolves, and I can't remember the third one, goblins or something like that. And he looked at some interesting small cases, or a small number of cases known as clinical vampirism. At least that's what they were kind of being known as. And again, these weren't real diagnostics. We're just looking at like these people who become obsessed, who think themselves delusionally so that they are vampires, right? Who become erotically attracted to blood, something we might call paraphilia today. They become obsessed with thinking they have certain ideas that they are thousands of years old, all sorts of these. And there were these isolated cases of these ideas of people who thought themselves to be vampires. And this, of course, traces itself back. A lot of these people are tracing themselves back to things from Bram Stoker, right? So again, that sensationalist literature comes back into play. And he starts poking fun at DSM speak, these notion that the DSM presents this very medicalized model of how you're supposed to be diagnosed with a mental illness. You have a variety of axes, right? Patient presents this kind of emotional disturbance for at least 30 days or more. Then on this axis, patient presents this other symptom for 3 weeks or more, or has a variety of levels of intensity that could be established by the psychiatrist. And it became like you would talk in this way of these kind of like bullet points to describe how this, this is psychoticism with traces of paranoia, followed by delusions of grandeur, with manifesting for 6 months at a time between and it becomes this kind of very medical terminology, and it became kind of a joke because that's how everybody was talking to each other about it. And so Knoll is poking fun at this and presents this kind of as a joke in a book that was never meant supposed to be taken seriously. And then yet, on a kind of one of those weird twists of fate that would make Foucault happy to see, because it was the stuff he would trace, somehow or another we get this academic backwash where it gets out into popular culture, and then popular culture gets into psychiatric peer-reviewed journals. And it gets known as Renfield syndrome, named after, of course, Renfield in the Dracula book, who is this kind of character who becomes monomaniacally obsessed with what we call zoophagia, which is the eating of life, or eating of things. And he would collect flies to grab spiders, and then he would use spiders to collect all sorts of different things. He kind of up these scales until eventually he's collecting birds, and the birds to get to cats, and then he'd eat them live and whole, and it would make him get sick, and he'd do it. And so this is, of course, this famous character who goes insane because Dracula utilizes him when he comes to London. And this Renfield syndrome He's like, they show these classic characteristics and it's supposed to be a joke and then suddenly becomes real. And he starts saying, like, 20 years later, right in the 2000s, they interview Noel again. He's like, I don't know how this happened. Like, this is one of those scary things. And he goes like, and one of the problematics of having a psychiatry only set of a DSM where we start inventing new ways of classifying people and we get progressively more and more totalizing, more and more labelizing these people. And we still, I mean, this was the 1980s when we think, oh, well, maybe we've cleared this, right? We learned our lesson. Perhaps, maybe not. Into the 1980s, it would only be until the end of the publication of the DSM-4, and even then not until the publication of its addendum, which would come out years later, that homosexuality would be removed from the DSM as a mental illness. Again, lemons are still in mental illness, even in our new medical model, with all that we know about the history of psychology, what we know about treatment, what we know about people put onto the edges and borders of society. These things are still thought of as madness. And it won't be until the DSM-4 with its addendum that we get being gay as being not mentally ill. You could be put into an asylum against your will. You could undergo treatments against your will, all the things for your gayness until the birth of the DSM-4. And now we're on the DSM-5, which came out just a few years ago. And psychologists, again, are upset about this and have a lot of controversies because the way that the psychiatrists have reworded some things, certain things that were not considered mental illnesses are now being put into a fringe for political, economic, ideological reasons. Let me give you two examples. Grief. Now, we know a lot about grief. The psychology of grief has been going on for quite some time. There are a good number of experts about this, and there is no time limit to how grief works and how long it lasts. Nor now we understand, nor do you ever really get over it. And yet, under the new DSM, grief itself could be considered a form of depression and should be, by the DSM, treated, medicated, as if this person is majorly depressed. In the same way that we might think of as a person who has not experienced grief in the traditional sense is treated with depression. And it's not allowed. So grief, a normal human experience that has been around for thousands of years, for as long as we know recorded history, right? Our earliest epics like Gilgamesh talk about Enkidu's grief, are now being pathologized, are now being said to be unacceptable. So things that used to be normal are now being fringed because, well, if you're grieving and if it's making you sad, well, that might affect your employability. It might affect your ability to return to work. So we better get you on some happy pills. And again, this might be in relation to something like the advent of positive psychology, which has been another controversial aspect in psychology because it's pathologized negative emotions, such as grief or sadness. Eccentricity now. Everybody's got that eccentric aunt, right? Or someone in their family or some family friend who's a little bit weird, but they're totally harmless and they run their lives are just a little bit odd. Under the DSM-5, there are ways that a person could be diagnosed as on the light end of the schizophrenic spectrum simply for being eccentric. Now, or diagnosed with what we call schizotypal personality disorder. And again, once you get these labels, you can never really shake them. And any future things might be misconsidered because you have been labeled in these ways. And this has always been the power and the danger of using mental illness, right? Because it has been weaponized. It continues to be weaponized. It continues to have problematic notions of how we diagnose people. So we have to pay attention. Pay attention to what is considered healthy, what is considered not. We've adopted a monomaniacal culture, and with the advent of COVID, we've actually seen something great. And so we're seeing like maybe we were doing something wrong. We're kind of forced to step back and realized that the way we had been behaving, that kind of type A personality driven stuff, might not have been healthy. And I hope personally that this leads us into some new theoretical questions about what are we really doing about mental illness? What are we really thinking about? How can we really reconsider? And there's a lot of new movements coming out about saying maybe our approach to mental illness and the medical model might not be what we thought it should be, and we should probably start thinking on new tracks. And that's kind of where we're at today. And that's all I've got, Sarah. So back to you, I guess, if we have time for questions.
Yes, we do. We have time for questions. I was refreshing our Facebook.
Sorry, I wasn't watching time. That was my bad.
Oh, you're fine. I was not either because it was super fascinating. So totally fine to go over a little bit. But yes, if anyone has questions on our Facebook, feel free to type those. I'll give you a few minutes to do that, and I'll refresh as needed. Or feel free to do it even if you're watching it later. I'll be able to get back with Chase and update.
Yeah, I'll watch the feed. I'll make sure I comment or like on it or something so that it hits my Facebook.
Perfect. Great. I was trying to think if I had anything myself, more observations than anything, because really, even, at the Glore Psychiatric in the 60s, they started the museum to try to destigmatize mental health and just show people, even really those early 1700s, 1800s kind of therapies, and where they had been developed since then. And then about the 60s through the 90s. And like you said, even today, we're still having to,
Yeah, and we were still lobotomizing people through the 60s, right? Which is just this shy of this notion shy of medieval torture techniques that we were using back then.
Right. And that's one thing I always get to as like a tour guide for that section, of impressing on people like how recent all of this stuff is, but also kind of, contextualizing, like, they didn't know what germs were in 1800s either when they're trying to figure all this out. And that in 1990, that, homosexuality was taken out of the DMS. So that we've gone so far, but there's still, so much more that we need to know about the brain, for sure. So thank you for all those perspectives. I agree with a lot of those on like, well, maybe we're getting too much into like the happy psychology, but nothing's wrong with, grief and sadness every once in a while.
Right. And as someone who studies negative affect, right, it's always just like, no, we have bad emotions for a reason. Don't try to erase them.
Right. Well, and that's the thing too, just like, you have all your emotions, and being someone that deals with mental illness on a daily basis, and having this as my work setting, and being that advocacy, I'm like, DMS like just considers a diagnosis is affecting your life more than 2 weeks. Yeah. So a lot of people fall under that.
Yep.
As much as, it could be a daily thing. It could be just 2 weeks of your life.
Yep.
And then you could technically be diagnosed with that. So I think that's a strange factor for some people, that it could be so common.
Yeah, and hold on, so you'll never shed those labels, right? Like you can have a psychotic episode once in your life, maybe in your early 20s, and never have one ever again. And this happens, not very commonly, but it does. And you would be a schizophrenic in remission. You'd never be a schizophrenic cured. So anytime you go in for anything, again, your doctor's always going to look sideways at you and be like, "Are you sure? You sure you're not having a schizophrenic episode?" Right? And to be doubted like that is enough to drive someone crazy anyway.
Let's see. It looks like we have a question. I'm trying to load it here. Let's see. We had a question. So are there other models that you think would work better than the DSM?
So full disclosure, right, is that I'm a psychoanalytic scholar. So my inclinations are towards a more psychoanalytic understanding of mental illness. So it would be more of these kind of categorization. The labeling doesn't really help, and you treat the symptoms as they occur in differences. Now, that's not to say there aren't biological models. And there's actually, speaking of it, let me just say it this way. The WHO, the World Health Organization, has actually just started this year looking at a new way of creating a whole new diagnostic system that separates out from the DSM. I'm trying to remember the name of the initiative, but it's brand new. Like I got notice of it that they were just kind of got the go ahead to start it like a month ago. And there are other versions of doing this. So the DSM always updates itself next to another document. I think it's called the ICANS, which is a more international one. And they do take different approaches, but it also might be worth looking at. This is the problem with mental illness, right? Is that should we be diagnosing it in the first place? I didn't mention it because we started talking about other things, but like, take, for example, what we might diagnose as schizophrenia. You're talking to people who aren't there, seeing things that other people don't see, right? You put them in the United States now when we would call them a schizophrenic and we'd hospitalize them or put them on heavy duty medications. You go back 3,000 years and that's Muhammad, that's Moses, that's pick any of the number of major prophets from any religion. Examples of like things that look like depression here in the United States because a particular culture. I remember one of my clinical teachers talked about a time where they were hosting an international student at their home, and she was from one of the Scandinavian countries. I can't remember, Sweden or Norway or Finland. And her friends were like, we think, they came to him later because he's a clinical psychologist, and they came like, we think she's depressed. I mean, she's really quiet and she doesn't say a lot and she's really kind of pulled in. And he came up to her and it's like, hey, your friends are concerned. And he broached, he's like, are you feeling okay? You're staying with us and, I can help if you need to. And she just started laughing at him. He's like, what's so funny? She's like, at home, I am the obnoxious, bubbly one. Like, and I haven't changed, but it was perspective, right? The cultural perspective of that. So is there a good answer for the DSM? The DSM is used because it's the insurance model that we use in medicine, and it really dictates it. So I hope so. I hope we can come up with a new one. I'm not total anti-psychiatry, which is a whole movement in that. But I do think that there's enough problems in the psychiatric use of that we should definitely be reconsidering other things.
I think that was the only questions that I saw from Facebook now. So, but like I said, we'll be watching that over the next few days as this gets shared and around the web. But thank you for your time, Chase, today. And I think it's a real interesting perspective too. And if you haven't made it down to the Glore Psychiatric, definitely do so.
I still need to. I keep trying to, and then it closed, and then it was like, I gotta see if
we're open now every day from 10 to 5. So you no excuse anymore.
I think our honors program is making a pilgrimage this and I'm teaching honors psych this semester, so I'll see if I can sneak down with them this year.
Perfect. And I would like critiques on our second floor because that's where we talk about the history of mental illness. So cool. But yes, and anybody feel free to come down and learn a little bit more of that. A little introspective, and we're always trying to change what you think when you come in the doors. So thank you guys for your time tonight. Have a good rest of the day.
Thanks, Sarah.